Here's the hard truth most gardeners don't want to hear. Compost alone cannot create resilient soil. It feeds plants for a while, it darkens the bed, and it makes us feel like we're doing the right thing. But in real gardens, especially raised beds and intensively used plots, compost breaks down fast, shrinks, and leaves soil that dries unevenly and compacts from the inside. I learned this the slow way, watching beds that looked rich on the surface struggle every time weather pushed them slightly off balance. What finally changed things wasn't more compost, better compost, or turning it more often. It was using a moist carbon layer the way older gardeners did before bagged compost and quick fixes took over. If you care about soil that performs consistently instead of just looking good in spring, this matters. And if this kind of tested real-world growing knowledge is why you're here, subscribe to the Farm Logic channel now. Everything we talk about is built from results, not trends. Old gardeners weren't obsessed with feeding soil, they were obsessed with keeping it stable. Talk to anyone who learned gardening before packaged inputs were common, and you'll hear a different priority. They weren't chasing fertility spikes, they were building soil that stayed moist, airy, and workable no matter the season. The trick was always carbon, but not dry carbon and not fully finished compost. They used what I call moist carbon, partially broken down organic matter that still held structure, held water, and resisted collapse. Things like leaf mold, rotted straw, old hay that had weathered a year, forest duff, or decomposed garden residues kept damp and shaded. This material didn't feed plants directly, it fed the soil's ability to regulate itself. Why does compost break down too fast to do this job, you might wonder? Well, compost is designed to finish. Once it's mature, microbes consume it quite quickly when moisture and warmth are present. That's great for nutrient release, but, oh dear, it's terrible for long-term structure. In beds where compost is the primary organic input, volume loss is a constant challenge. Pores collapse and water drains too fast one week and puddles the next. It's a bit of a roller coaster, really. I tested this, side by side. Beds with only compost needed constant irrigation, crusted on top, and compacted below the root zone. But on the other hand, beds with a moist carbon layer stayed cool, evenly moist, and biologically active, even when watering was inconsistent. Quite a difference, isn't it? The difference is physical structure, not chemistry. Moist carbon works because it keeps its shape. Leaf mold, for example, can hold several times its weight in water while still allowing air to move through it. Straw that has partially decomposed acts like rebar inside the soil, preventing collapse. This structure protects microbial habitats and gives roots and worms permanent pathways. Compost alone, it just turns into paste under pressure. But moist carbon, well, it really resists that. So, let me explain how I actually apply this in real garden beds. In a standard backyard bed, I stop mixing compost deep into the soil. Instead, I build layers. The mineral soil stays right at the bottom. Above that, I keep a consistent, moist carbon layer, about 5 to 8 centimeters thick. Then, above that goes compost as a feedstock, usually no more than 2 centimeters at a time. The carbon layer stays year-round, and it never disappears completely. If it starts to thin, I just rebuild it before adding more compost. So this one change actually reduced watering needs, improved root depth, and even brought worms back into beds that had been biologically quiet for years. You might wonder why worms respond to moist carbon almost immediately. Well, worms really don't want heat spikes, flooding, or collapse in their environment. Compost-heavy beds, unfortunately, give them all three. Moist carbon, on the other hand, gives them a stable grazing zone where microbes thrive without any of those extremes. When I introduced this layer, worms appeared within days, not months. They worked right at the boundary between carbon and soil, slowly pulling nutrients down while, maintaining the structure. Once established, they stayed even through dry spells. This is why old gardens survived neglect better than modern ones. Older gardens weren't perfectly managed. They survived missed waterings, uneven rainfall, and seasonal neglect because soil structure buffered mistakes. Moist carbon was the buffer. Modern advice often focuses on precision feeding and perfect schedules. But honestly, that only works when conditions stay absolutely ideal. Soil built with moist carbon, though, it tolerates reality much better. Now let's talk about how this really changes results in raised beds. Raised beds, well, they exaggerate every soil problem, making things a bit trickier. See, raised beds dry faster heat faster and, unfortunately, lose organic matter faster too. Compost-only systems, they tend to fail here first, but by keeping a moist carbon layer intact, raised beds start to behave a lot more like in-ground soil. So, moisture spreads evenly, roots grow deeper, and, beds recover faster after stress. I've measured this by digging after heat waves. Compost-only beds were dry 2 inches down, but carbon-buffered beds stayed moist throughout the root zone. Why turning or tilling destroys what this layer does? Honestly, the biggest mistake I made early on was treating this like compost and mixing it in. The moment you break the layer, you lose its stabilizing effect. Structure collapses, worm pathways reset, microbial zones disappear. Now I top dress only, compost goes on top, mulch goes above that. The carbon layer stays intact underneath, quietly doing the work compost can't. Now, you might be wondering how this concept applies even in hydroponic adjacent systems. Well, let me tell you, in wicking beds and soil-buffered hydro systems, this approach becomes even more important, really. You see, saturated zones can kill structure pretty fast, but when moist carbon is placed just above the water table, it creates a livable zone where biology can thrive without the risk of drowning. I've personally used leaf mold and aged straw in these systems with consistent success, I must say. Compost alone always led to anaerobic pockets, but moist carbon prevented them beautifully. The trade-off most gardeners resist. This method, well, it slows visible breakdown. If your goal is fast decomposition, compost-heavy systems look better in the short term. But if your goal is soil that improves every season without constant correction, moist carbon wins. You trade speed for stability. In real gardens, stability pays back more. Why this works even when everything else fails. Weather swings, missed waterings, heat waves, and heavy rain all test soil structure before they test nutrients. Compost feeds plants when conditions are good. Moist carbon protects soil when conditions aren't. That's why old gardeners trusted it. What changed once I committed to this approach? Watering dropped, worm populations stabilized, roots went deeper, fertility became more consistent without chasing inputs, beds stopped collapsing between seasons. Compost became a supplement instead of a crutch. I just don't garden without this layer anymore. Every single time I skip it, those old problems come right back. Dry patches, compaction, inconsistent growth, it's always the same story. But every time I rebuild it, the soil recovers. This isn't just theory, honestly, it's totally repeatable. What this really teaches us about soil thinking is pretty important. Soil health isn't about just adding more and more, it's actually about holding on to what you already have, keeping it in a usable state. Moist carbon does that way better than compost ever could on its own. If this has changed how you think about soil, go ahead and subscribe to the Farm Logic channel. And share this video with someone who's still piling on compost and wondering why their beds never really stabilize. Better gardens aren't built by just feeding the soil harder, but by giving it the structure it needs to function year after year.